So I need a little more.
Do you want to, Charles, do you want to introduce what we're doing?
Yeah, sure. So welcome to the Dialectical Social Ecology discussion group. This is our second attempt, well, not attempt, continuation of our attempt to read Catherine Malabou's Au Voleur. I'm not a French speaker, so I will butcher all of those. But last week I believe we looked at the first two chapters. The machine we tried translating via machine translation, which has posed some problems. But the first week we had decent conversation, and now that this one we're turning to chapter 3 and about Aristotle and arche, and kind of I guess uncovering ambiguities in concepts of governance and that sort of thing. So that I think this kind of brings us up to where we're at presently.
We have a baby here.
Aw.
Want to put him on? Whoops.
Aw.
Hi.
There are people there watching you. It's a kind of strange, it's a strange
Hi.
world that he just entered into.
Is he like a chameleon baby or something, blending into the background?
I don't know why I don't disappear sometimes. I used to disappear more. I guess I've adapted more to that psycho region.
It's the artificial intelligence learning, and that's what Charles fears the most.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also we just got thousands of new bees out here.
Oh, good.
Our hive swarmed. So we had a partial swarm once and it recovered, but we had a big swarm earlier this year. So now Jay, our beekeeper, is also out here, and he has brought some new bees.
Well, great. How long have they been reestablished there? Just very recently?
Like an hour.
Oh, well, good. I hope you get some honey again soon.
Oh, we probably will. We did get a crop of honey this year, of miel de la terre, and if any of you come here, you get a free jar of honey or two.
Well, that's even more incentive.
Well, there is talk about trying to get the group together, or maybe both groups. I think it was more the ape group that had been talking about it.
Yeah, that would be great. I think they were talking about maybe early next year. Is that?
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Well, I guess we can begin. What did we think of this? Was this? I mean, even though the translation's a bit wonky, I mean, I think it at least revealed a lot of ambiguities as far as some of these concepts that I think could be important.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of things interesting. She's just, and we had talked about doing the Levinas chapter, but then Charles, you sent something out about the Schumann chapter. So I started reading the translation just to see how that went. I read the Aristotle in French, and it made sense. The Schumann made more sense than I expected, although occasionally it was obvious that some words had just disappeared, but most of it made sense. At the beginning of that chapter, she really starts doing some important things with her project. There's something else popping up. I'm sorry. The computer the artificial intelligence decided that it wanted to ask about a security scan, which it put in place of the picture of this meeting. Anyway, you're back. So we have this chapter on the virtue of the choir masters and arche and anarchy and Aristotle's politics. And it's an important critique, and she claims that there are echoes of what Aristotle did throughout the history of political thought, and that these later philosophers somehow tie in with this. And I don't know how clear her analysis was, but fundamentally, she talks about the aporias, the three aporias, and we could just say the contradictions or implicit contradictions. And some of the heritage of those contradictions, in which, as you probably know, in some ways, Aristotle has been a big influence on what I call orthodox social ecology. In a certain sense, the Aristotelian teleology is preserved there. The idea of civic virtue is important. The idea of the polis being a kind of model for what we might want to create. And she's pretty devastating about Aristotle, and that underlying his conception of the polis, and I think it's because of the actual politics of the polis also. There are several things she could have mentioned. One that always occurred to me is that often not enough attention was given to slavery and of course patriarchy, but she focuses on the domestic economy, which in a sense incorporates the other two, because the domestic economy was based on the subordination of women and the exploitation of slaves. So that there's a kind of, in a certain sense, there's this distinction between the citizen and the good person, or the good man, it's usually translated as the ethical ideal. And the good person, l'homme de bien, which I think is the machine translated that kind of in a strange way, didn't it? How does it translate, l'homme de bien? It was something very bizarre, as I remember. I don't have it here.
Where in the chapter was it?
Oh, the man of well.
Oh, yes, yeah.
The man of well. And I was just wondering what people made out of reading about the man of well. It's a very bizarre kind of thing. That's what I love about some of those kind of translations. They used to be much better at that than they are now, of being totally Dadaistic. Now they generally make sense, but they have lapses of that sort. So the man of well is like just Aristotle has this idea of the good life, self-realization, eudaimonia, the person who has achieved all of these virtues, as we sometimes translate it. It really means excellences. So it's the person who has attained the greatest excellences. And there's this distinction between the citizen and the man of well. And it turns out that the man of well is really like way above the run-of-the-mill citizens, and that ultimately the ruling part is more associated with the man of well than the whole of the citizens. So that this is an echo, she thinks, of the domestic economy with its hierarchical conceptions. Male dominance, slavery, patriarchy, etc. And also this idea that Aristotle said that every organism has a ruling part. And she mentions that. that just as the body has a ruling part, which is the mind, the family has a ruling part, which is the father, the city or the state has a ruling part, which is the rulers. You know, and of course, it also ties in a certain sense with his theistic idea of a prime mover. So on every level, there is a kind of arche at the heart of things, or let's say the mind of things. People say more than the heart. So that's what the critique is about, and she thinks that the archism of Aristotle is echoed in the history of Western philosophy, and really, I think she's going to try to show in these thinkers, in these primarily French thinkers that she criticizes later in the. And then she carries on this at the beginning of the next chapter, more specifically with Schurman's ideas about arche and anarche, and the idea of ontological anarchy versus anarchism. And you know, that's the beginning of her critique of these philosophers. Like, why can they not face the reality of anarchism or political anarchy as opposed to ontological anarchism or anarchy? And her idea that there's a certain repression or disavowal going on. So, I mean, I think this is a really important and interesting project that she's carrying on. I mean, we can look at some of the details of this, like the three apori, the aporias in the politics. So that, for instance, the first one, every citizen is by definition capable of at once commanding and obeying. But then that's A. Then B, only the principle of the best should preside over the choice of rulers. Certain citizens are therefore more capable than others to command. So, you know, her idea that I think comes up already and comes up in the Schurman chapter is that arche is about, as she said, well, origin and rule are the two things. You know, that's basically it. But this is the commanding part, that certain, if you look at his ethics and even, you know, a lot of what he says in the politics, some are more capable of ruling than others or commanding. So that's, you know, the other two kind of are similar kind of problems. You know, the second one is about the nature of government or ruling. And the government or rule is supposed to be an executive power. But she also says that government or ruling and state sovereignty are synonyms, so that the ultimate power, you know, it's not just executives. It's not as if all the citizens are free and equal and the government is just carrying out their will, that there actually is a governing part that is the ultimate source of power. So there's a kind of contradiction there. And then there's more of a textual point in the third about the problems between the more idealist, or we might say theoretical chapters, and the more realist or practical chapters. In particular, she deals with the supposedly democratic aspects of the state or the city, and the nature of the Constitution, which ultimately goes in a non-democratic direction. So it would be interesting really to read Aristotle's Politics or some of the chapters along with her critique, but I don't know if we have time to do all that.
It would seem as if with these two chapters together that, in the end of the third chapter, this critique of, Aristotle's laying out of the different forms of government. So the critique of form, and the basically introduction of like the domestic realm as part of that critique. And then also at the end of the fourth chapter, what it seemed as if she was saying is that it's a, like to say one is anarchist is not anarchist, but it's nonetheless, it's important. Like you can't be anarchist precisely without being anarchist. So it seems like what she's suggesting is like a prefigurative kind of model, or not model, but proposal for the kind of politics that she's talking about. Like it's about, the doing,
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess ultimately we all have to be both flute makers and flutists, saying. And once you get the flute makers as a separate class, behind the Constitution and rule, you're in trouble.
I understood chapter 4, I think, much better than chapter 3. I was convinced by it. I think that I was convinced by ontological anarchy, and I wasn't expecting to. So we could say more about that when we get to that chapter. In chapter 3 on Aristotle, what was I going to say? Well, we're talking about musical instruments, and I liked that Malabou didn't give Aristotle the same pass that I've sort of seen Bookchin do. So Bookchin loved to quote Aristotle saying, when there's a lyre that can play itself, at that point in time, we won't need to have slaves anymore. And I think Malabou understood that the hierarchy of Aristotle's Politics was much deeper than that. It's not something that automation could just wave away.
Yeah, there's an interesting history there, because in a certain sense, Marx was a left Aristotelian, and he kind of took up that theme, and the idea was that the machines would perform the function of the slaves. And I mean, interestingly, you get Marx really the Marx as the bourgeois, and that the Marx of well, in the future, if you put together, the Paris manuscripts with the Grundrisse and other things, you get the idea that we will, every day we will hunt and fish, which is will be a sort of almost recreational activity, and we'll be critical critics. We'll have a salon, in the evening, and on the other hand, as he says in the Grundrisse, that this vast technological machine will take over the process of production. We will stand to the side of it as its overseer and regulator, which is like rulers. We will be like these leisurely, we'll go out, hunting if we feel like it, or fishing if we feel like it. Well, he does say we'll rear cattle in the afternoon. I mean, I don't know if anybody who has actually reared cattle would think it's something you can just like do in the afternoon in between fishing and talking, and in your salon.
I've always thought I would be way too exhausted to be a critic in the evening after all that physical activity. I mean,
Well,
it just sounds like
yeah.
an exhausting, jam-packed day. I wouldn't want that to be my daily activity.
Yeah, I guess, although, I mean, I think if you look at it in connection with Marx's technological utopianism, this would be a little, okay, this is a terrible parody of Marx, okay? I admit it. But it would be more like Marie Antoinette, at Versailles, having her garden, working in her garden, and like herding her geese or whatever she might want to do in the afternoon, that you wouldn't really have to be like slaving away. That it would be much more like early societies that didn't know they were working when they were doing some of these kinds of things, rather than the society of toil and exploitation.
One of the things I didn't know about Aristotle was that he apparently had some kind words about democracy, at least in the idealist books. So,
yeah. Right. Well, the classic way of discussing Aristotle is that he goes through all the forms of government, and that he says that the best one is a mixed constitution or a polity. That's the classic way of describing Aristotle, which meant that it would incorporate aspects of democracy and aristocracy. But I mean, Malabou would be suspicious of that. That if you still have the archic principles there, it would really undermine any authentic democratic aspects. Which is, I'm suspicious of all those kinds of. Originally when I had a big dispute with Bookchin and people in social ecology, it was partly about the dangers of the assembly, and the dangers of rhetoric, the dangers of people being able to manipulate masses or assemblies, and that my argument, partly based on some feminist analyses and discussions of indigenous practices and other things, was that if you want democracy, it has to kind of pervade the society, and that you might have all kinds of committees and commissions in which the citizens participate, and all kinds of cooperative endeavors. I mean, one of the things that we find is that, this is true in Chiapas and a lot of other places, that when women have been able to take a leading role in cooperatives, their place in governance has been far beyond what they've been able to achieve in assemblies, where men still dominated in many ways. Not that means you have to accept that, but I think we have to be realistic about, there's always this problem of the transition. And, the problem of the transition is that you usually don't transition into what you were looking for. You transition into some grotesque parody of what you supposedly were trying to achieve.
Isn't was it Mark Antony from the Shakespeare play? Was it the Julius Caesar? Where he gives that speech. Marlon Brando plays him in that movie. Isn't that supposed to be like someone did an interpretation of that as like use of rhetoric in like fomenting fascism or something? Am I off base there? I thought I read that somewhere.
I don't know. Maybe we could pursue that question. I haven't read it or seen it in a long time. Anybody have any ideas on that?
Well, I have kind of probably a dumb question just about chapter 3, right, on Aristotle. So I was thinking a bit about, obviously Bookchin, right? And I mean, is Malabou kind of like doing his, I mean, is the attempt to, in chapter 3, I mean, it's not to like overcome Aristotle, right? But it's to tease out ambiguities that might support like an anarchist sort of critique of it. And if so, like, would, that seems like it could potentially like strengthen, the argument within Orthodox social ecology as far as, I don't know. Was that anything? Is that something?
I mean, I don't see that. The first part I have to completely agree with, that she's trying to do an anarchist critique because it's a critique of arche. That's fundamentally what she's doing in the chapter. Now, I don't think she's thinking about social ecology at all when she, is doing this. But I'm not sure what you're thinking. Like, what is it that would reinforce what? It's hard to judge unless you know exactly what it is that leads to what is connected.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't know that. So.
But you must have been thinking something. You must have had some suspicion that in some way it would do something like that. I'm just curious, why the idea entered your mind.
Well, I guess just, generally, with Bookchin, it seemed like he really only threw out broad strokes of things and never really kind of dialed it down. And it seems like Malabou might kind of be doing that here in a way that would be helpful to his project that he was uninterested or unable to do. But, it's a very superficial.
That would work. That's the only thing I would want to know, because it's hard to assess something unless you know what the progression of ideas is that would lead somewhere. I mean, I think it leads you to be more suspicious of the Greek polis than Bookchin was. I mean, he did say it's not a model. I mean, he didn't say we'll just copy the Greek polis. Obviously, he didn't believe that. But there are just so many suspicious things in it. And I don't think it's bad to be extremely critical of something and still think you can learn from it. But it's always important to be extremely critical because so many things can go wrong. And I've seen them go wrong in things that I've been involved in. I'd be interested in where, Malabou ultimately goes with this politically, because I've read a lot of her stuff, but I haven't really seen any kind of political vision, and I don't know if she'll ever do that. Maybe she doesn't want to do that. But I think she's helping us out by saying what we have to be aware of or beware of, I mean, she does seem to say over and over again that all of these thinkers seem to be afraid to face the possibility. And she does kind of formulate it as a situation in which government does not exist. And government would be rule. That's what she means by government. To me, it's kind of hard to imagine a system in which nothing that has of the sort that has ever been called government would not exist. But she does qualify it. She talks about state sovereignty and a number of other things. So I think one thing we have to narrow down is exactly what her target is. you know.
Well, there's John, you might be pointing to the distinction between arche and kratos to some degree, right? I mean, where you hear people talking about anarchy, you know, I don't know what the equivalent word would be to be against kratos, but I think that there are people out there that want to get rid of any government whatsoever. Bookchin certainly wasn't one of them.
Right. But I mean, some people have used in arche, or I haven't even heard it in English, but it has been used in Europe by some anarchists in Spanish and French, I guess. ACRATIE, I guess would be the word, arche, which some people just talk about, you know, use it as a synonym for anarchy or an anarchist position. Because we have kind of inherited the two terms as overlapping, because different forms of the state or government have been you know, both terms have been used to describe that, because it's like aristocracy, you know, would be one of the forms. Monarchy, but aristocracy, you know. So the two terms have been used interchangeably for systems of state sovereignty and rule.
One of the things that really infuriated me at the beginning of chapter 4, if it was okay, so I understood Sherman was saying that ontological anarchy could go with any sort of politics, including tyranny, oligarchy. Any of those are compatible with ontological anarchy.
Right.
And I just thought, what the hell is the point of ontological anarchy if it, you know, can go along with tyranny or oligarchy? I think Malabou shares that criticism and goes on to explore it, but
Right. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I only read like a third of that chapter. I wasn't sure if we were actually going to do it or not, although I'm really interested in it. But I think it's very important, and you know, it tells you where she's going. Like, how can these people pretend to support something called ontological anarchy and then not see a connection with political anarchism? But of course,
and I mean, it's especially infuriating that it seems like Sherman has a lot of patience for Heidegger, and
yeah,
you know, obviously he was a Nazi, and that doesn't make his thought useless. But here you're going to have a whole like book generously drawing from Heidegger and not credit the anarchists. I mean,
right. Yeah, that's kind of crazy. And the other thing is, if you want to find a good example of how this like radical critique of the tradition and so forth can go together with just the worst possible politics, it might make you want to think about the connection between ontology and politics a little more, you know, and think that maybe there is a connection. I didn't even bring a copy. Unfortunately, I just realized I didn't bring a copy of the English, which is what I looked at in this chapter. I just have the French here, unfortunately, unless it's buried somewhere. Oh, wait a second. Oh, I do have it. I found it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Because I marked up the part I read, the first few pages in particular. And a lot of it, I think, is really interesting. It's incredible how much I marked up, actually, and really thought was helpful. I mean, a lot of it is just the problem with Schumann's position. And she's kind of showing where he goes wrong, really.
I'm remembering when Levins and Lewontin said that the science of any particular era tends to map onto the social structure, right? And so during the ancient times when Aristotle was writing, and it was a very hierarchical, the rulers and the citizens and the slaves, it made sense that that was kind of the great chain of being view of science. And then moving on to the dawn of capitalism, and everything is laissez-faire, and we're atomic individualists. So of course, that's the start of Newtonian science, and the universe is just a bunch of billiard balls, individuals, right? And so it just strikes me that if you want a real ontological anarchy, it has to be based to some degree in an anarchist politics. I'd be hard pressed to put my finger on exactly why that is, but I worry that if you're not coming from an anarchist political position, or able to at least be familiar with political anarchy, how are you going to have a reliable theory of ontological anarchy? I worry that if anything, it's going to be more closer to neoliberalism, leveling all the the playing fields, at least supposedly, but not having the mutual aid there, not having the communion there.
Yeah, I would have some questions about basing an ontology on a politics. Well, first, I'm not sure if you have to base anything on anything else, because I've actually, for analytical purposes, I think that can be really good. In fact, I've done a couple of books in which I've done it that way. And I've started with more, like my book on William Godwin works that way, and to a certain extent other things, where you start out with the person's, like what's been called first philosophy or metaphysics, ontology, first principle, sometimes it's called, and then look at like the person's outlook, their conception of the cosmos, of nature, and then maybe human nature and history and so forth, and then go from that to maybe an ethics, and then go from that to a politics. But that's the way I've usually done it, starting with the most basic things, like what is the nature of reality? Politics is part of reality, obviously. However, I don't really believe that ultimately you can, this would be crazy and like Cartesian, like when Descartes wants to do a philosophy that's like it's like mathematical proof, and Spinoza kind of carried on that same form, but in a much more interesting way. One question, is there really a difference becomes a big word, difference between the ontological and the political? I mean, what is the ontological? What is the ontology about? That's a fundamental question. What is it about? And it's about being. Of course, it's about becoming. If you read Hegel, you read being, non-being, becoming. That's he begins. The logic with ontological concepts or categories. But is there some reason why we should think that being is not political? It seems like, obviously Aristotle was saying, well, what is the most beginningless concept possible? It's being. There's nothing, you can't really, well, what's beyond being? It's kind of hard to think about that. But this sounds so abstract that it seems almost impossible to tie it in with the political, but this is the way I would do it. How does being appear to you? And there are modes of being, being is not just this abstract thing. It's also that we are beings. Beings appear to us. Things come into being, or non-things come into being, or, so how do they do that? And everything is always appearing in a certain way. This is actually why Heidegger is kind of interesting, because he actually does get into these questions. And I think our challenge is not to avoid the questions or reverse things and not make the basic questions less basic, but to do it in a different way. What he begins with this Zuhanden and Vorhanden, ready to hand and present to hand, yeah. And it's basically the difference between things appearing as useful to us or as something we're going to do something with, as opposed to being out there, just present to us. And I think if we look at how being appears, there are real political implications, because, again, to go back to like Marx and Paris manuscripts and all of that, being is having. Things appear immediately as possible sources of exploitation, use, instrumental use, having, accumulating, which is very political. Or we can have a more contemplative or aesthetic relationship to being.
So I take your point, I think. I mean, the feminists said the personal is political. I'm sure that somebody out there, maybe you, is saying the ontological is political, right? Everything's political. And so I guess maybe a better way to think of the connection between our view of the cosmos and our view of society is more dialectical. The way I was presenting it before was very unidirectional, and and I agree it's kind of crazy if it's unidirectional, but yeah, they're definitely linked. I don't know that I follow everything you said about the nature of being, but
well, it's kind of hard to follow something when you start talking about something like being, because it's the beginning of going somewhere with it, more than saying something contained about it, But the other thing is, Heidegger has these concepts like present to hand, ready to hand, present at hand, I guess it is, and ready to hand, Zuhanden and Vorhanden. And he also, it turns out, care becomes very central in Heidegger's, being in time. And in a certain sense, he touches on really important questions. Care is very fundamental. And I think care is related to a certain way of being appearing to us, the being of things appearing to us. Being is, we never like come across being, do we? Never like go out. If I go out here, I'm in the country now, I go out into the woods and I find being. Well, I don't really find being, like there's something that's being, but I find things being, or, even saying things being is like limiting it in an invalid way, because there's this complexity of being is there. So, and of course, being there is one of those concepts that Heidegger deals with very much. Dasein is being there. And that's his name for humanity, really. We are Dasein. And it raises a lot of questions. I think that, it's very important not to dismiss Heidegger. I think it's really great to detest him in a lot of ways at the same time, but also to appreciate the questions that he poses and have our own answers, our own collective answers. But the question of how does being appear to us, or how does the being of things appear to us, I think is a very fundamental question. What is the tone of reality, or the tone of being? You know, I think mood is very important. We often get tied up in what's there, but how it's there is really important. By the way,
It's
I
like
read,
saying,
go ahead.
I
Sorry.
was just gonna say, it's like saying that a particular condition that person might have is something, but it's how it's perceived, which is most crucial thing. You know, you could be locked in a room and it could be prison, or you could be, you know, in a defensible position. I don't know, you know, like, I'm just bouncing off of what you said.
Yeah. It's not just about me or you or individual persons, because this is collective. You know, there's a sense of being. This is why, you know, I write a lot about ethos being important. And that's another thing which I have to admit, that Heidegger is one of the philosophers that really did a lot with that. That we don't, in any way, we don't live in isolated worlds. You know, the world is with us. The world we live in is with us. You know, the phenomenologists have done some pretty good work on this, about the life world. You know, we live in a life world. We certainly live in a cultural world that shapes so much about us and how we experience what we think of as reality.
Mhm.
And I read Villeros de Castro's article, by the way, which I found to be very interesting and sketchy in some ways. I really don't like the way, for half of the article, he runs through one anthropological dispute or debate after another without really getting into them. It's almost like name dropping. But then he finally gets to some of the real questions. And it's not entirely clear to me what he's trying to do, but I have to admit, I read a good part of Graeber's response, and I want to finish that up, which is one reason I was doing too many things at the same time and didn't finish some of them. But there's some real questions about whether the ontological turn is really an ontological turn, or whether it's a turn about ontologies. But at a certain point, it seems as if it's really not about ontology as much as ontological relativism. That's really what it's about. And that Graeber, I think, at least in the first part, I don't know what I read, a third or half of it or something like that. I think he's coming up with some very good questions about an ontological relativism. And well, you know, one of the big questions is the question of, you know, the universal, the particular, and the singular, which we confronted in Hegel and in Malabou's book, The Future of Hegel. I think Graeber is in part saying that this ontological relativism fails to see where there's a moment of universality in aspects of culture, and that Villeros de Castro seems to only see the imposition of one culture on another, where there's the possibility of one culture learning from the other and seeing some commonalities, which I think is an extremely important issue. I know we weren't supposed to read that, but I know at least Tony and Dan were exchanging. I still haven't read all of your long exchanges, but that looked interesting too.
Yeah, I'd love to spend a week talking about those essays, I have a ton more thoughts on them that I wrote some of those emails and I didn't understand at the time what they meant, but now I think I understand them. So but we
I
could
wanna
talk about
read
that
what
next
you
week.
wrote. It looked interesting. I just didn't have the time to do all these things. And also I have to finish a conference I just do want to mention there is the Deep Commons conference Thursday through Saturday of next week. And I'm going to be doing the concluding session, and I'm still working on, I think I know what I want to present. But the conference is rather amazing. Matt York in Cork, Ireland, has basically done all the organizing, and there are 120 people doing presentations on panels or workshops or a few keynote, 120 participants, and already 400 people are registered for it. And there's also an exhibition in connection with, which is online, which I've looked at some of it is videos by artists. And that in itself is quite impressive. So
Yeah, Carrie's doing her workshop again.
oh, good.
And I'm moderating 2 panels.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Okay.
So did anyone else read the Sherman chat? Because I had more questions about it, particularly about the section on Plotinus and this concept of henology and then negative henology. Did anyone else get to that?
Yeah, well, I can't say much because I was listening to it for the first go around, and then I went back and read, but I actually didn't get to this part quite. No, actually I did, but I don't know if I got really much from it.
I mean, should we do this chapter? Should we maybe next week talk about it? By the way, Heather, you're not going to put this on YouTube, I hope.
Yes, that was the idea, is to get
Please.
more people listening to you and engaged, and then we put the link so they can join it. What are you afraid of?
I'm not afraid of anything, but I don't know, maybe that's a good question. Is it fear? I mean, I have a problem with it.
Maybe we should
of the
turn.
ontological wolf. No, sorry.
Maybe we should turn off the recording at this point because it seems like we're getting into sketchier waters.
Well, I mean, for one thing, we're talking about a chapter I haven't read. I read like a third of it or less, and so I would be throwing out ideas that, normally I put some work into preparing for these things, but this is a questionable project to try to talk about a very serious book by reading an absolutely awful machine translation, and then I'm looking at the French to try to correct certain things. So it's more like a work in progress rather than something that you want to present to people.
It's not for the faint-hearted. It's for the real groupies of someone, of either her or you.
Well, maybe I could share some of the things I found interesting about this chapter, and that'll give a preview for next week when we talk about it. All right, so she says Plotinus is the first anarchist, and I thought that was really interesting. I'd love to explore why she said that. Plotinus says she describes Plotinus as one, the one with the capital O, as a unification that does not govern. So I thought that's interesting. In Judaism, there's 2 ways of interpreting the main prayer, the Shema, the Lord our God is one. And so one could be the monotheistic version that, okay, there's a God above and he's governing us, right? That's an authoritarian one. But you could also say in a more Neoplatonist or Plotinus's interpretation, that we're all part of God. God is the unifying force. And so it's interesting when you take the word echad, which means one. Keith can back me up on this, perhaps. The Hebrew letters add up to the same value as the word love does. So the thing that unites the one is love. if you're not familiar with like each Hebrew letter, like this is chai, the yud is 10 and the chet is 8, and that's why you're supposed to give multiples of $18 as a gift at like bar mitzvahs and stuff. So each letter has a different value. So 1 and love are the same value. So Plotinus is unification as a Plotinus is 1 as a unification that does not govern. I thought was intriguing.
Have you seen Darren Aronofsky's first movie, Pi?
I don't
Black and
think
white.
I did.
So
Pi?
it's yeah,
Yeah, really interesting movie.
yeah. The numbers in the Hebrew Bible, that was his whole project. The protagonist is trying to find the secret key to the universe by interpreting the mathematics in in Hebrew.
Cool. Okay, so she writes about the delegitimization of the deconstructive reading, and that sounds a lot like dialectics to me. I mean, I'm kind of curious about where dialectics fits into Malabou's project, and I've heard some people argue that who argues this? What's that guy's name? Wolf, something Wolf. Anyway, he says that deconstruction and dialectics are like two separate projects. They have nothing in common, but it sounds very dialectical when she talks about the delegitimizing of the deconstructive reading. It sounds a lot like the negation of the negation. You start with the reading, then you deconstruct it. That's the negation. That's the original negation. Then you delegitimize the deconstruction. That's the negation of the negation.
Well, right. But of course, that's from her point of view. And I mean, she's not one of these people who claims to be non-dialectical. I mean, you were with us when we did the Future of Hegel book?
No.
Oh, you weren't? Okay. Well, I mean, it's a very sympathetic reading of Hegel.
Mm-hmm. I liked the whole idea of the impossibility of calling oneself an anarchist, because anarchy is itself an arche. And she writes that this very impossibility, the very contradiction, is what makes it so profound, is what makes it so useful. And I have a whole lot more thoughts on this idea of a self-defeating principle, what I call a paradoxical principle. But those are my thoughts, not necessarily the Malabou's thoughts. So maybe we could save those for the end.
Where is the passage that you think is interesting where she says that? Would you say what footnote it's near? Because it's easy to find things in relation to footnotes.
Okay, let me look.
There's another passage I want to go to on when Dan finds his.
Okay, Tony, you go first. I'm still looking for mine.
Oh yeah, it's on the bottom of page 22. It's on the subject of principle. It goes back to
Possible that
Aristotle.
you get a footnote that's near it, because if you have a different printout of it, it's hard to find.
Right, yeah. So 50. Footnote 50 is the middle of the paragraph.
Okay, I see 51, 50. Okay.
So I thought this was quite interesting, and it relates to something else I've been thinking about, not related to this, but later on. So, definition of principle: the common character of all principles is therefore to be the source from which being, generation, knowledge are derived, but among these principles, some are immanent, others external. And then it says it is necessary that the principle is related in some way to the things of which it is the principle. Otherwise, it would not be the principle. He must form with them a community, logical, ontological, political, but it must also differ radically if he does not want to become himself assimilable to the things that it commands, having both at the same time. The principle can be neither in or out of that which it is the principle. So, I mean, to me, it sounds as if, if there is to be any sort of operative logic to a community or a group or, rationality, that it has to be fundamentally lived and it has to be operated from within who it is intended or it is functioning, and so it can't be something that's external to, like, that seems to be the sort of imminent critique of this definition of Aristotle's principle.
Mhm.
And it related actually to, in my head, it related to what I was thinking about, concluding or contributing in that Deep Commons presentation. Writing about one approach to development, international development, from this guy named Robert Chambers, who talks about participatory development. Long story short, he just has a set of biases that are practiced by the development professional because of institutional, practices, obligations. And so they clash with the practices of the community. It leads to failure. It leads to all the problems with development. So what I was basically leading to is that effectively you have to either, as a professional, have to make a choice to deprofessionalize and become part of the community in a sense, or you have to go the way of the arche, So it's like, yeah, I'll stop there.
I did find the passage. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to really multitask, so I didn't hear Tony's comments. But when we're ready, I can point people to my passage.
Okay. I'm not sure how far we should go with it. I think it's something to keep in mind, the idea of the principle containing its own antinomy.
It's in endnote one, right after endnote 105.
Okay. Right after that? Okay.
Yep. So the machine says the impossibility of calling oneself an anarchist would not contradict anarchism, but would respect it. The dissociation between anarchism and anarchism would form this double bind. And she's getting the term double bind from Gregory Bateson. So the double bind is be an anarchist, right? It's an injunction. And it's one that an anarchist shouldn't follow. And by not following it, that's furthering anarchism. So let me continue. Which in its impossible possibility is a powerful weapon against governmental prejudice. The double bind, in fact, cannot be governed. The schism between ontological anarchy and political anarchism, which cannot coexist without poking each other's eyes out, would ultimately be the anarchist signature of the principle of anarchy, which is the title of Sherman's book.
Mhm.
So what I like about this idea of a paradoxical principle is that it's always in motion. It's not really negating itself, but I think it's nuancing itself. It's challenging itself. It's there's a negation of a negation of a negation of a negation. It forces you to keep examining it.
Yeah.
So the precautionary principle, the critics call it the paralyzing principle because it doesn't let you do anything. But I prefer to call it an example of a paradoxical principle. And I think nature abhors a principle, except for these paradoxical principles.
Hmm. So how would you formulate the precautionary principle?
It depends who you're asking. That
I'm asking you.
no, I realize that, but there's multiple me's. I
But
realized this the other night, that I have this analytic person, and then I have this more dialectical or more wild mind inside me. Maybe it's the difference between Dan and Tarantula, but I have my notes for some paradoxical principles. You ready for some of them?
Why not?
Okay. The precautionary principle: don't do anything that's too risky, but the riskiest thing of all is to take no risks. The pleasure principle: seek pleasure, even though that sometimes means holding off in the short term. The peace principle: seek peace and fight for it violently when necessary. The prohibition principle: it's forbidden to forbid, including the forbidding of forbidding. The play principle: relax and voluntarily play. That's an order. The prefigurative principle: organize to prefigure the world you want to build, but that world's not going to be prefigurative. The perennial principle, which I could also call the Pentateuch principle, because it's the most important part of the Torah: to love your neighbor, love yourself; to love yourself, love your neighbor. The pretension principle: this has to do with like being a professional: fake it until you unmake it, make it until you unfake it. Yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Right.
The thing that makes the precautionary principle self-defeating is that if you're truly being all right, so let's think about how to formulate it. Don't do anything unless it's proven safe. Well, we don't know that adopting the precautionary principle itself is safe, right? It takes off of the table perhaps some of the most necessary ways to combat climate change. The right-wing critics would say it takes nuclear power off the table, but I think that's a rather good thing. But I might argue that it takes revolution off the table. So it's just a way of not taking these principles to, I don't know. I'm having a hard, I'm trying to put my finger on it, but
Well, I think I would recommend really thinking about each of these, like taking one of them and thinking, what is it? You have to know what you're talking about to know whether there's some sort of internal contradiction in it, exactly what the contradiction is. And I think something like the precautionary principle has been used in a very loose sense. And you formulated it as something: don't do anything unless it's safe. Well, usually the precautionary principle is formulated, or often in level of risk. Not so. For one thing, the idea of something being safe is not self-evident. I mean, what does that mean? We have a colloquial conception of something being safe. So, we drove over here this morning on the interstate. Was that safe? Well, yes and no. I mean, there was a certain level of safety. I mean, is something, does it even make any sense to say, is something safe, without further qualification? I mean, how could you possibly use that as a guidance to anything? Because the question of whether something's safe is an open question, which immediately requires, this is one case in which there is an actual meaning of begging the question, which is used so loosely now. But it kind of begs the question of the meaning, of safe in that particular sentence, which is not clear. And certainly, if you proclaim a principle, like millions of people have heard about the precautionary principle. Do those millions of people all have a common conception of what's safe? No. So, it's obviously, in what sense could that ever even be a principle? I mean, what does it mean to say it's a principle? I don't know.
Okay, so let's look at the how the Rio Declaration defines it.
Okay.
I'm going to put it in the chat. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary principle should be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. So that's known as the weak formulation.
Mhm.
And I believe this second one is a stronger formulation. This comes from the wingspread statement. When an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. In this context, the proponent of an activity, rather than the public, should bear the burden of proof.
Mhm.
Lastly, there's a Paul Burkett's extended definition, which I can find in a second.
There's a lot of shooting going on here.
Civil War started.
Well, I think it ended, but some people don't. The next Civil War, you
The
mean?
next, I mean.
Oh,
yeah.
no. That's a good question. I hope it doesn't break out around here.
All right, so I put Paul Burkett's definition. So there's the precautionary principle proper, which says that if an action may cause serious harm, there is a case for counteracting measures to ensure that the action does not take place. The reverse onus, under which it is the responsibility of those supporting an action to show that it is not seriously harmful.
Oh. Is this the one that says a reasonable summation is the beginning of it?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I was still looking at another one. I mean, point number one, some of these are rather questionable. The implications even are not clear. But point number one is kind of interesting. It makes sense. If an action may cause serious harm, there is a case for counteracting measures to ensure that the action does not take place. I mean, even that, I mean, there are some questions about what serious harm is, but I mean, there is a certain common sense nature to this. I mean, it raises certain questions, such as, I mean, there is another alternative that immediately arises, which is that instead of not doing it, take counteracting measures to assume that the serious harm does not take place. If someone wants to do something and it will produce serious harm, there are two ways of presenting the serious harm. One is not to do the thing, and another way would be to change conditions so that it could be done without the serious harm following.
So the precautionary principle, I mean, I've seen it, like, for example, in confronting potential GMO legislation, like in India, or, that they'll, confront, its adoption with the precautionary principle, that's including GMO brinjal or mustard will have ripple effects across the ecosystem, and they'll appropriate the precautionary principle. So under a legal definition, like, or what is this, how it's appropriated is for the purposes of litigating certain proposed actions, like through, say, class action lawsuits or stuff like that? Or is it like looking at it as like an operative principle, like this is a guideline for taking action, like as a person, or like as a community or whatnot?
Mhm. Well, I really think that this would not be a topic. This could be a topic that would be worth spending some time on, really looking at some of the debates over this. Because the more you look at it, the less, especially this last one, the less this looks like a principle, and the more it looks like a framework for decision making, with a lot of variables and a lot of considerations. But one question is this: Malabou has a certain definition of a principle that's relevant to her whole analysis, and a principle has something to do with well, the way she says commencement and commandement, which is origin and rule. So from the point of view, if this has any relationship to Malabou's discussion, in what sense would any of these formulations of the precautionary principle have something to do with origins? And secondly, what does it have to do with rule or commanding? I mean, one question would be, if something is more like a moral let's say exhortation, something of that sort, to exhort someone to act morally, would that be really a principle in the sense that it has something to do with arche? I mean, another question I have, if we bring it into the sphere, I mean, I used to teach environmental ethics a lot, and usually the textbooks that we used had sections on the precautionary principle. They didn't have any of these versions of it. But these textbooks never really went into like real philosophical questions, like in what sense is this a principle?
Well, if it's an operative principle, as Tony said, right, this is what's guiding decision making. I don't see how that's not archic, right? We're talking about how a government is making decisions.
Well, for instance, let's say, what was your formulation? Operative what?
Tony, what did you say? An operative framework, maybe an operative guideline?
It's very important what it is, because if you say it's an operative principle, you're not going to prove anything about a principle by saying it's a principle, So what is it?
I think it's a rule. It's a rule that you always have to follow.
Okay, what is a rule?
A rule is an injunction that
Well, is
you
it
need to obey.
So this is you need to obey. Okay, I mean, this is really interesting to follow it. Do you need to obey it because of punishment that's going to be inflicted, or do you need to do it in order not to incur moral guilt, which is a different situation?
For the precautionary principle, I think
For a principle, for something to be a principle.
Mhm.
Okay, I want to give an example of something that seems like a principle to me. Act so that the maxim of your action could be a universal law of human conduct. Okay, that's called the categorical imperative, according to Immanuel Kant. And I think, I would want to think about it more, but according to what I have thought about it, it seems to be like a paradigm case of a principle in ethics. He reformulates it, treat all rational beings as ends and not as mere means. That sounds like a principle. He says the two are equivalent. But the first one is, I guess, in a way, the more famous formulation of the two. Act so that the maxim of your action could be a universal law of human conduct. And he says that you can test this by imagining what would happen if everybody would do what you're doing. For instance, if you would lie, it would destroy lying. If the only way anybody can lie is because people follow the rule, tell the truth. Therefore, some people can lie. But if everybody lied all the time, lying would lose its meaning. It would be self-contradictory. But that's not. But the point is that Kant thought that this was part of a moral law. We had a moral obligation to follow this rule. It's a rule, and in a certain sense, he thought it was kind of equivalent to the golden rule, also, which might seem more like the second formulation: treat all rational beings as ends and not as mere means. Because presumably we want to be treated as ends and not as mere means, and that's kind of part of the core of the golden rule, treating others as we would like to be treated. So I mean, that to me is, in that area, we're in the realm of rules and principles, clearly. While the precautionary principle does not so clearly fit into that paradigm, is what I'm saying. People use the word principle in many different ways. Now, a guiding framework is a much weaker claim. For instance, when I drive here, I take I-10 to the state highway that comes here. I take a certain way of getting here, but there are other ways to do it. But under ordinary circumstances, I know what's the best way to get here from 65 miles away. So is that a rule? Is that a guiding framework? I mean, obviously, yes, it is in a certain sense, but it's not a principle, certainly not in Malabou's sense, and not usually. It would be kind of weird to say, I have a principle of coming here that way. But of course, it would be something I would recommend to other people if they don't want to get lost or waste a lot of time. Also, if you find out that there's a traffic jam on I-10, there's another way to get here. And that would be the rule that I would recommend following to save a lot of time. So, I mean, one thing I'm saying is that there's a lot, there are problems the way language works and the way our concepts work, that they overlap in some ways, they don't overlap in other ways. We use concepts that have certain connotations, sometimes in common, and sometimes they don't overlap entirely. One question is the precautionary principle a moral principle? Kant's principle did not necessarily imply that people should be punished for not following it, which of course you couldn't punish everybody for not following it in every case. How often in everyday life do we not treat all persons as ends? and not as mere means. Of course, he does say you don't always have to be thinking about that. You can in everyday life, there are ways of treating people that are or not like trying to live up to some moral ideal, but they're not immoral either, and they're okay. Although he really didn't have a good critique of ideology and realize how some of those things do have moral implications. Like he believed, fair contracts and so forth were moral, where he didn't see the more systemic injustices behind them.
Mhm.
But so I'm asking the question of what is meant by a principle. But of course, the most relevant thing here is what is the relationship of something to what Malabou calls a principle.
So maybe what might help, John, is how does the categorical imperative relate to the to an origin? If arche has to do with origin, what Kant's thing have to do with origin?
Well, that's a good question. Now, it does, because he believes it's part of a universal moral law, which is ultimately, the will of God, basically. Although, we have to look at the way he deals with these questions. In a certain sense, in Kant's philosophy, you get the feeling that even God is secondary to morality. That in a certain sense he says, why should we believe in God? Because morality would have no meaning if God didn't exist. Something like, he actually says things sort of like that. We have a right to believe in God and morality demands it. So ultimately it's a kind of faith, and it's a faith in that value has meaning. So I would say that in Kant, there is a kind of, we could also talk about foundationalism. It goes back to something very basic that things flow from. And there's also this question of, he really does believe that it's commanded. It's the moral law. And, he believes it's a law because it's something that you are required to do. It's not optional. The moral law is the word he uses is imperative. So you have no choice in the matter. But of course, what happens is if you don't follow it, you incur moral guilt.
So what I'm arguing is that some of these principles are embedded in nature. So Freud wrote about, we'll go to the pleasure principle, for instance. Freud said that was part of human nature. Of course, he thought that it needed to be replaced by the reality principle, and Marcuse says that today it's replaced by the performance principle, and maybe we'll have a new reality principle. But yeah, I guess I see these as being anti-principles of nature.
What is an anti-principle of nature?
A paradoxical principle of nature.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question about the pleasure principle in Freud, in that for Kant, I think the principle in Kant's sense of a categorical imperative has more relationship to what Malabou is saying. Because in a certain sense, in Freud, the pleasure principle is not something that you're really subjected to, like to a moral law or something of that sort. It's more how the psyche operates, which for Kant would be, a different realm that isn't even relevant to value, ought, morality, etc. It's something you have to deal with. So for instance, let's say Freud was right, and there was a pleasure principle which was important in human behavior and the human psyche. Kant would say, well, those are the facts that you have to deal with in the world. That would not be in itself part of the world of morality, the world of value, the world of the ought. It's what you have to deal
Well,
with.
you're giving a very high bar, because Kant believed in a transcendental realm that Freud did not.
Yeah, and I think that's what the principle is about, that Malabou is talking about, that even if someone is not like a Kantian, kind of idealist, that there's something like that that goes on in the world where these principles do have some meaning of that sort. So for instance, well, I don't know, I would be giving another similar example with Lacan and the big other and all that. But also, I think she's saying that politics is really infected with principles of that sort. There is a kind of transcendent element. And in that sense, well, I think that indirectly Freud was involved in all that. So for instance, when you get to, civilization and its discontents and his kind of justification of repression, there is something transcendent that justifies it, which is civilization, which is, what his conception of civilization, which I think there was an imperative there for him. And he actually, he admitted at a certain point, his question was, what is the justification of instinctual repression? And his answer was civilization is the justification. And the question was raised, is it possible for, well, Kant was really a precursor of Freud, very specifically in one way, that he discusses the objections to the categorical imperative and obeying the moral law. And, people ask, well, why does there have to be so much suffering? Why does it have to be so hard to follow the moral law? Because he was justifying repression the same way that Freud was, in an earlier age. And he said it's because it's a law, and a law is a constraint on human nature. And if you just follow human nature, you are not going to be, you're not going to attain the good. You're not going to do what is right, which is the most important thing. And he actually discusses at one point, some of the Europeans were traveling, they were going to Polynesia, like Tahiti was this big, there were people like Diderot and so forth that were writing about these places where people were happy. And Europeans were so miserable compared to them. And Kant actually replies to that. And he says, this only proves that happiness is not the goal of human existence, or else we would be like the inhabitants of the South Sea Islands who spend their lives in idleness. I mean, he says something like self-indulgent and procreation of the species. And you can imagine him like sneering about these people. Oh, they're very happy, but look what kind of life they live. They do not achieve the great things that civilization has. So in a certain sense, Kant and Freud are very much in the same tradition, but by Freud, you get this positivist, more element of positivistic kind of materialist analysis, secularism, sort of break with the kind of theism that Kant invoked. But in a certain sense, underlying it is some of the same impulse, let's say.
So what about and then we'll move on, because I appreciate the ruthless criticism and hope it continues. But what about looking at it this way? Can you derive an ought from an is? No, but you ought to. And so what I mean by that is you can learn from nature these ways of living well, right? So the reason why you follow these is because it helps you have fun. These are guidelines that make life more fun. You follow them, you'll have either you'll get pleasure in the near term, or it'll keep you alive and healthier longer so that you can have more fun later on. So if life is kind of like a big game, the rules help you have fun playing it. And so that's kind of my thesis.
The rules. Which, and some people, well, I mean, one question is, if you're out for fun, maybe rules should be very conditional.
What do you mean by that?
Well, rules may not be the best way to achieve fun. Breaking rules is often a better way to achieve fun. Even if you have good rules, sometimes you just forget them because they're not as much fun.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going to use as the standard.
So I'm okay with that, with life having rules that sometimes you should break, but I think life is more fun with those rules, right? Like the golden rule is something that we brought up, and that was one of my things. I called it the perennial principle, and I'm glad it exists. I think life is more fun if we're following it. I think there's certain times in which maybe it's fun to break it, but I don't know. Are they transcendental? I don't know. I mean, I put a quote in the chat where Tom Goldtooth seems to think that the precautionary principle is transcendental. He's a Navajo activist, the head of Indigenous Environmental Network. Mm-hmm. Anyway, sorry for this tangent.
These are very basic questions. And it relates to the question of what are principles and in what sense are they principles. I mean, the question I would raise in relation to what you're saying is that the golden rule is conducive to a number of things. And I'm not sure if fun is the best way to depict that. It's not the most traditional way to do it, but I mean, there are real questions there because I'm sorry, this is my job to raise questions like
I appreciate it.
What is fun? And I mean, there's been a lot of critique of fun, the society of fun and pursuing fun. And there was a book, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Right. Neil Postman, yeah.
Neil Postman, who was a great writer. He wrote a wonderful book on education many years before that, which I'm forgetting the name of now, but I remember I liked it a lot. Anyway, he wrote some great books.
Well, his chapter in Amusing Ourselves to Death on education is fantastic. He gives a great critique of Sesame Street. Perhaps it's unfair at certain points, but I think the gist of his argument is important, that the point of education should be learning how to learn, not learning the facts. And so if you learn the facts through singing along with these Muppets or through a computer game, what are you really, who cares? It's some facts, but you're not learning how to, pick up an actual book, and you're not really learning how to learn.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, why should we follow these rules? I think that's an important question. Erich Fromm would probably agree with, he wouldn't say fun, but I think Fromm was sort of an Aristotelian in this sense. He says, life is an art. He didn't say life is a game. He said life is an art. And just like there's rules for making a good drawing, the rule of thirds and the various rules, there's rules for art, for life. And it helps you live a good life. It helps you achieve self-actualization, is what Fromm says. I think my version of it's a little bit more open-ended.
Right. I mean, there is a point about this. I mean, the fun thing, I think, deserves more consideration, and how we might formulate what we're looking for, and also how we might think of what is it that we get out of something like the golden rule. And I mean, one alternative to looking at it as a way of having fun, everybody having more fun, which I'm not denying, is that I think it really is based on a certain idea of personhood and opening up the realm of personhood to one another. and like opening up a whole universe of experience to one another, and appreciating that in each other. And I think that just goes so far beyond fun.
Right.
But I would hope that a lot of fun would be involved in that. But you know, I just
No. I mean, I'm my idea of the game being a metaphor of life, or game being a fractal of life or something, and it comes
Right.
partially from Alan Watts and from the idea of Lila, and I think it can take us to a certain place, but like with any metaphor, it's not complete. There's more to life than a
Right.
game. But
Right.
I think you're agreeing with me that rules are necessary for having fun, right? I see this in my classroom. If we're playing a game and there's no rules at all, it's no one has fun. But if they agree to follow certain rules, then we can actually have fun. It's a question of how the rules are written, who makes them, how strictly they are adhered to, and there's various questions that arise. But
Right. And I think it would be a mistake to identify a rule of any type with a principle or arche,
okay.
which is quite different, because actually there are arches involved in games, and that it's usually what destroys the game.
Could you give an example?
Well, for instance, in sports, there are systems of domination that are at work, so that games are about the ego. Games are about defeating others, or about accumulating status, gaining power over others. I mean, ultimately, you have a world in which you look at the news about sports, and it's mainly about financial misdeeds or maybe rape, or who knows what the latest subject is about sports. I mean, those are the things that emerge from games being related to power and domination. But about rules, there's some big divisions within ethics, and usually the two big alternatives in ethics are called either deontological theories or teleological theories. Now, teleological theories do not necessarily mean teleology, like metaphysical teleology. It means that ethics is about pursuing a good that can be achieved. Deontological theories are usually described as theories in which the right is prior to the good. You do the right, like Kant says, do the right thing. The moral law is to do the right thing for the right reason. The right reason is to obey the moral law. And then he tells you what the moral law is, which we can understand through the categorical imperative. A teleological theory would be, there are two major types in Western philosophy anyway, and you can also apply this to other traditions like Taoism and so forth. There's utilitarian kind of theories that say create the greatest pleasure, happiness, or maybe fun for the greatest number. That's not usually listed, but maybe we could fit it in there somehow. The greatest fun for the greatest number. That would be the good that could be produced. The other type is a self-realization, self-actualization, which maybe Erich Fromm would fit into more. Aristotle certainly did, and others fit into. And it is, the good is not something like pleasure or happiness, but the good is something like the self-realization, the actualization, the unfolding of possibilities. Hegel and the German idealists and so forth had this kind of view. Goes back also to Aristotle. And I think in some ways, Asian philosophies like Taoism fit into this in many ways. Okay, so there's something important about this. If you hold a teleological theory, ultimately all rules are conditional, that it's not based on rules in any way at all. The rules are only rules of thumb that are adopted because of some other kind of justification, either utilitarian, let's call it consequentialism is a larger term for that. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism, or a self-realization kind of theory. So I just want to make it clear that ultimately, if you accept that kind of theory, rules are never arches. They're never principles.
Mhm.
I'm going to
Unless you're using,
I'm going to stop the recording here because
I didn't know you were
go.
recording it. I thought you had stopped a long time ago. I mean, just let's see what we need to use this for, really, though. Okay, some of
Oh,
this
yeah,
I think could be helpful. Some of it I think could be helpful.
Can be useful for people who miss a week and want to
Right.
catch up
right.
as well. And or to see what we're like before they commit to coming to one.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go also because we have people here, unfortunately, a baby who keeps crying, but we have other people here. We have to go back and do more stuff with the bees. And, but I think it's good to go into some of these fundamental questions about ethics and politics and, what we're talking about.
would you say real